Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Workology. Diversity and inclusion are not new ideas in the HR and corporate arena, but in recent months, the importance and significance of D&I in the workplace has gotten leaders throughout corporate America to think about what doing the right thing in our community looks like. For many of us in HR, this means we're not taking our D&I initiatives to stakeholders. They're coming to us looking for answers, and we must be ready to respond. Today, I'm joined by Jim Rooney. He's a business owner, national public speaker, consultant, and author of A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. Jim is the son of Dan Rooney. He's a former owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and his book talks about his dad and the work he did in the areas of diversity and inclusion for the NFL. Jim, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Jessica, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with your background. Your father, Dan Rooney, took the Steelers from the worst team in the league to one of the most successful. He drafted some of the first Black players and was seen as an innovator because of his approach. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So, we go into a lot of that in the book that I just wrote. So my grandfather started the Steelers back in 1932. And as you said, we were the worst team on the field. We lost more games than any other team. You had all types of stories. I think one that really gives you an example from a business standpoint of how bad we were is that, you have sponsorship relationships with different products, and most people have some type of car sponsorship. Back in the late 40s and early 50s, we had a deal with a Buick dealer in Pittsburgh. And the car he gave us, because we were so bad, couldn't go uphill. And everything in Pittsburgh is on a hill. So my father used to have to put the car in reverse and back up a hill anytime he went up, and it said official vehicle of the Pittsburgh Steelers on it. So I think that gives you some sense of how bad we were in the early days. Then my father really took over the day-to-day management and, did a lot of things. He committed to tried and true practices. He really brought vision to the team. He brought a hiring process that has been known as one of the best in all of sports, really effective negotiating skills. And then one of those was part of his vision was a commitment to what he would call integration. And so he hired a gentleman named Bill Nunn, who was one of the first African-American scouts in NFL history. And from 1968 to 1976, the Steelers drafted more players from the historically Black colleges and universities than any other team. And those folks went on to win more championships in a shorter period of time than any other team. They took really important roles, and there were several milestones. In 1974, our head coach Chuck Noll named Joe Gilliam as the first African American man to be named the starter of a starting quarterback prior to the beginning of the season. And the quarterback in football is by far and away the most important position. So this was really an important milestone. Obviously, the Bill Nunn hiring the scout, and then Tony Dungy, who went on later to win, was the first African-American man to win a Super Bowl championship as head coach, was named as our defensive coordinator. He was the first African-American man to be named defensive coordinator, and also the youngest person to ever be named defensive coordinator. So you see this commitment to innovation. It really changed our organization, and it was my father's vision and design, and then he implemented that through a whole host of business decisions that really sort of created a competitive advantage for us
and shaped the entire future of football. I mean, it's fundamentally changed because of his decisions and forethought to bring in great players.
Absolutely. So many of these guys, ended up in the Hall of Fame. Donnie Shell is just getting in this year. He went to South Carolina State, one of the historically Black colleges that we talk about. John Stallworth, Mel Blount. Mel Blount is probably the greatest cornerback in the history of the game. Went to Southern. His big rival school is Grambling, which is probably the most well-known HBCU. And I always tease Mel. I have a hat that a friend gave me from Grambling, and whenever I'm around Mel, I wear that hat. So we keep those competitive experiences going all these years later. But it, it was a special time and a special group of people, and they really came in with a different perspective. Mel had never had any white coaches or teammates before he got to the Steelers, and he gets to the system and really feels this sense of welcoming and the ability to participate. And as I said, that decision to name Joe Gilliam as a starting quarterback really sent a message of trust to these players that, if you're willing to not let, these old biases get in the way of who you're going to start at your quarterback position, the players really understood that at every position you were walking the walk. It wasn't just lip service that we were giving these ideas, but that we were implementing them in a meaningful and practical way.
Your father was also the league's diversity committee chair, and the requirement to interview a minority candidate for coaching and executive position now bears his name. For those of us who haven't heard of it, can you talk to us about what the Rooney Rule is?
Absolutely. So the Rooney Rule is a requirement, and then there's some more to it that my father was heavily involved in, but it requires when there is an opening at a head coach or general manager position that now it's been updated. There are at least 2 minority candidates in your final pool of interviewees. And so the reason that's important is that one, it's called the diverse slate of hiring. And, you're forcing people to really bring in folks that they may not have had the same experience with, as they develop their organizations, they manage their organization, and sort of forcing that change. And then having 2 is such an important upgrade versus just 1, because all of the social science demonstrates that 2 candidates in the pool, 2 candidates in the final pool of interviewees really begins to break down biases. That when it's just 1, oftentimes that 1 candidate gets looked at as sort of the minority candidate, and it almost puts them into another box, which is the whole point of this is to break down these boxes. So having 2 in the pool, I think, is a really important piece of the rule. The league has just also updated now to include the assistant coaches, the folks that support the head coach. There's a Rooney Rule requirement in those hiring positions, as well as throughout the entire league now, the vice president jobs at any level, whether it's marketing, communications, finance, requires a Rooney Rule. And in that case, the Rooney Rule has gender and sexual orientation as part of the requirement for those jobs. So it goes beyond just race once you get to the jobs at the office level.
Dan Rooney was known for his willingness to talk and hear from those who disagreed with him. What impact did this have on the franchise and in the league? Why is it important to leaders in the workplace, do you think?
Well, I think you go back to the Bill Nunn story that we talk about. The gentleman I said was one of the first African American scouts, and so my father had this plan, this intention to become more integrated, and he realized he needed to take action. So Bill Nunn was a very successful journalist, and every year he put together an all-star team of the best Black college players, the best Black college all-star players in the country. And so my father sat down with him, and Bill was very critical. He said, look, the Steelers aren't doing a good job with this issue. And frankly, I don't know that you ever will. And, so that's a pretty different opinion than what my father was trying to, put together in the early days of his leadership with the organization. And he hired Bill on the spot. He said, well, I want you to come in and guide us. And Bill went from a part-time employee to a full-time employee and was with us, I think, for over 50 years. So, there's one example, but I think it is, that idea that my father did over and over again, which was, bringing people together, even if you didn't agree with them, to make sure that you are hearing different voices, that you're not just a yes person, but also from the standpoint of that person as well as the rest of the organization, you're creating that sense of trust. And, Google did a big study a couple years ago called the Aristotle Project. And they said, what makes up the most successful teams? And it wasn't the resumes, it wasn't, the positions that you had. It was that on good teams, people feel a sense of psychological safety. And, the most important component in psychological safety is a sense of trust that my voice can be heard, even if my voice isn't necessarily, the decision doesn't go my way. The idea that I can come to the table with my opinions, my viewpoints, my contribution is so significant. My father did that over and over again in his career, and you see the results in sort of several major decisions and initiatives that he was involved in.
I love hearing about this from a football standpoint, because I feel like sports, everybody can relate to it. Most people can. And then you think about it, about how this can be applied. I mean, the Steelers aren't just a football team. They're also a business too. So they are applying diversity inclusion efforts in their hiring, in their recruiting, and their employee engagement or their player engagement strategies. And you guys had amazing results that catapulted the Steelers to a whole different place. I mean, that's the best return on investment story I think that there is. And it's one that everybody can really relate to.
Well, yeah, again, if you go back to sort of the pre-'70s and those days, I talked about how bad we were in just about every category. We were lagging behind the rest of the National Football League and really the entire sports industry. Since 1970, which coincides, just about the time Bill Nunn came in. He came in 2 years before that. My father made this commitment to integration. The Steelers have won more games, more championships, sent more players to the Hall of Fame than any other team. And off the field, Pittsburgh's not a large market, yet we're in the top 5 in television ratings every year. In fact, over the last 5 years, Steelers have been involved in a game that's been one of the top 10 most watched television shows in America for 5 years. So that shows you where the brand affinity is there. When you look at merchandising every year, our jersey sales, et cetera, are in the top 5 or 10. So in basically every metric you look at, the Steelers significantly outpaced their marketplace. And it goes back to a whole bunch of, I think, tried and true business practices that my father, put into place. But certainly one of them is this commitment to diversity. And it is, it's not just been the right thing to do. And I think, that at the end of the day was why my father did these things. But it did create a competitive advantage. We have outpaced our market and outpaced our competitors, by making this deep and significant of a commitment.
Recent events in the United States have shed a lot of light on the topic of racism and equality. What are your thoughts on where this leads us and what workplace leaders should be doing, maybe that we haven't done?
No, I think it goes back to the example I keep using, but it just, it's such a great root to this tree that has grown over and over in many ways, or grown up in many ways. My father initially started this idea of saying, hey, we should integrate the team more. And, that was a good thing, but then it became apparent that, you bring folks in and they're natural leaders, and you need to be putting folks in leadership positions. So as I said, naming the first African-American man as starting quarterback, hiring someone at the executive level in scouting. We had with Joe Green, Donnie Shell, and Sam Davis in the latter half of the 1970s, we had 3 of our team captains were African Americans, and you generally only have 3 captains. So it was one of the first times, and certainly the first time a championship team had 3 team captains. Again, the hiring of Tony Dungy as our defensive coordinator, and then you move ahead to the modern times. Mike Tomlin is our head coach, and the hiring process that my father used to bring Mike in is sort of legendary. We've had 3 coaches in the last 52 years, and some teams have 3 coaches in 1 year. And Mike is the longest serving and most successful African-American coach in NFL history. So when you look at what do we need to do these days from a corporate standpoint, it's not just committing to diversity, it's committing to making decisions to put diverse people in leadership positions so that they can really have the ability to change the organization, to have an impact, to bring others up behind them so that there are more folks who look different, sound different, et cetera, and are able to be, making these decisions and really empowering organizations. The other piece of that I think is important is, when you look at marketplaces are becoming more and more diverse. And the idea that me as a white man can understand all the nuances of, someone in the marketplace that looks and has maybe a significantly different experience than me is a foolish business decision. So I want someone at the decision making, at the leadership level, who has that experience and can not only make my organization better, but also relate, to my customers or clients more effectively.
That last piece, I just want to record it and restream it everywhere, because it's what every business leader, what they should be doing, and trusting in different types of people with different types of experiences to help take their business forward. I mean, that's what diversity inclusion is all about.
Absolutely. And as I said, I might be biased because we've achieved so much success and as I said, created this competitive advantage by really going all in on diversity. And as I said, my father really in many ways was a pioneer in this. There certainly from a social and political position, he was heavily influenced by the civil rights era and Dr. Martin Luther King, but including that into business decisions changed sort of who we were. That is a good thing, and you feel that sense of camaraderie, of belonging, of welcomingness. I hope of being welcome, not welcomingness. I hope that folks feel that. But as I said, then it's also been the key differentiator for us in the marketplace.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Workology. We are talking today about diversity and inclusion with Jim Rooney. Are you studying for your HRCI or SHRM exams? Join our free HR Certification Study Group on Facebook. Search for HR Certification Study Group or go to hrcertificationstudygroup.com. Ace your HR exams with the HR Certification Study Group. The other thing I wanted to point out is you said 3 head coaches in 52 years. I think about most organizations with average tenure pre-coronavirus really being at about 2 to 2.5 years in the market. How amazing it is that. And so this is, again, another business story, business case of how having a great culture and having diversity and inclusion initiatives in a program that's formal and organized can drive really amazing performance, but also really fantastic retention results of your key people.
Well, yes. And I think that, the most important, HR decision you ever make, as everyone in HR knows, is the hiring decision. And so my father really took a significant amount of time, not just seeing the X's and O's, and that's the term people use for the technical side of coaching, not just saying, hey, is this person competent? You need to be competent. But really spending time in conversations, in deep and meaningful conversations about someone's mother or wife or children or some other relationship, maybe a coach they had in high school, and really looking for cues to see, does this person value other people, or did they use other people as a sort of stepping stone to move forward? And the idea that relationships are important and the value that one puts on other significant people in their life were the cues that my father really used to understand whether this person would be a good cultural fit. And he felt that, they can really have different approaches. Coach Noel was very quiet. Coach Noel was our coach, the most successful coach in Steelers history from 1968 to 1992. Coach Noel was quiet. He was a teacher. He really focused on simplifying things and then educating people on what are the best techniques and practices and strategies against their opponent. Coach Noel went to the Hall of Fame. Bill Cowher just got elected to the NFL Hall of Fame. He was much more of a traditional motivator. Coach, I always say to Bill when I see him, I wish you'd run for president. He just has that effect when he comes in the room. He gets you to want to do things that you feel that sense of motivation. I'm 5'7", 160 pounds. And when I'm around Bill Cowher, I want to put a football helmet on. He just has that strong motivational impact. And then Coach Tomlin is different than both of those folks. And he's just a very matter of fact guy. He's very straightforward, sort of emotions on his sleeve to a certain degree. It is what it is. He uses the term, the standard is the standard. So all three of these men have very different personalities, but my father in the interview process really felt that they valued relationships. They valued those who were important to them in a meaningful way, and that was the basis of what he wanted in the culture.
I've had conversations recently about getting comfortable being uncomfortable in relation to being a business leader. Your dad seemed very comfortable waiting in that discomfort, sometimes for a very long time. How do you think his ability to do this contributed to the success of the franchise?
Well, I think that was one of his core values. He really said, there's a term that Coach Noel actually brought, but that my father really embraced, and that is, you never arrive. And he understood that you had to step into challenging situations. You didn't try to get around them. I think the simplest example story is my father was a pilot. He had his private pilot's license. And so one day he's flying home from our training camp, which is about a 20-minute flight, and the power goes out in the cockpit. And so he was a little older at this point and had arthritis. He couldn't wind the wheels down. There's a way that if the power goes out, you can still bring the wheels down for a landing. He wasn't able to do that. So thank goodness this is during the time of cell phones. He calls the tower and says, look, I'm going to fly around and burn off as much fuel as I can, and then I'm going to belly flop the plane in the grass strip between the runway. So by the time he does all this, every first responder and every news organization in Pittsburgh is at the airport, and he belly flops the plane and comes in, and he goes home, and my mother's crying, and he says, what are you crying for? That was my best landing. And, there's obviously humor in that story, but I always say that's just such a good example, whether it was, his time in Ireland, and, there was a tremendous conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. And he set up a large global charity to really deal with the peace process in Ireland, and was considered to be a very effective charity. And President Obama actually eventually named him ambassador to Ireland. Whether it was labor negotiations, and he was the lead negotiator for the NFL versus the Players Association, and he always found win-win situations in very difficult negotiations there. Or obviously his work towards fairness and equity and race within the NFL, whether it was coaches, players, etc. Each of those situations were difficult. There were people with strong different points of view, different ways of how you were going to do it, and it was going to take a long time to really bring about any type of significant change, I think, in any of those major initiatives, let alone his management of the Steelers, which again he transformed. So he waded through decades, often trying to do the right thing, as he would always say, trying to play the long game, but not avoiding the difficult situation, being involved in conversations that would make you uncomfortable, but always being willing to address that, being willing to listen to someone who didn't have the same point of view, but not being people pleasing either. He had his backbone. He was a pretty tough guy. He was always willing to give you his feedback, because he felt like he created a container for respect where he heard your point of view, and then he expected that he would have the opportunity to give his point of view. So in doing that, stepping into challenging situations, I think in many ways energized him, and I think the airplane story is probably the simplest way to describe it.
We often compare workplace morale to morale on a sports team. Can you talk about that a little bit? Do you agree?
So, so I think that's fair and unfair. It's interesting. So on one hand, I think we all make judgments of people that we see on the screen. You might see, a quarterback and a wide receiver, and they walk by each other, and someone's rolling their eyes or not looking eye to eye at these folks. And there's an automatic judgment that these folks have bad chemistry. And the reality is that might be 3 seconds of time, and these folks are together, from August until January for, a tremendous amount of time. I mean, they usually live together in the summer. They travel together, to road trips, to away games, and more than 8 hours every day, they're spending time in classrooms as well as on practice fields together. So on one hand, the idea that we make judgments on this morale, is a little bit inaccurate, but I think that's a good point for your question as well, because I think we all do that. I think we make judgments on things that sometimes we only have a real small snapshot of. And I think it's important when we think about, morale or even, when there's a negative situation in the culture, are we putting too heavy an emphasis on just a snapshot that we saw? On the other hand, I talked about culture, and I talked about my father's commitment in the hiring process to really try to bring people involved, get people involved, and bring them on board on his teams that really had this fit, not just technically and with the competence you need, which again, you need those competences, but really in the way they value relationships. And I think if you create those situations, the group becomes much stronger than the individual parts. And I've seen that over and over again. I've seen it with teams with a lot of talent, our great teams in the 1970s who had a tremendous amount of players who went to the Hall of Fame and had more success than any other team. But also in later years when you didn't have quite the same talent, I've seen teams make the playoffs that were really didn't have enough talent to make the playoffs compared to some of their competitors. But because that culture was so strong that the morale, really was the thing that led them to become more effective than they would be, on an individual basis. So there's no question that if you build an effective culture, you're able to sort of go down and dig down and find that motivation and that resiliency that people need to up the morale when it needs upped and deal with losses, challenges, difficulties, whatever it might be, to have that type of morale to pull you through those difficult situations.
Well, Jim, this has been an awesome conversation. I want to talk about the book. Where can people go to get the book, and if they want to connect with you? Because I know you do a lot of speaking and different things. I think it would be money well spent on anyone that would bring you into their organization to talk with their employees and business leaders about the work that you're doing.
I greatly appreciate that. And all of my marketing folks are ready to kill me, I'm sure, because I probably won't hit all these as well as I should. But you can get the book, A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's Story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule, at Amazon. You can get it at SteelersShop.com. I think that there might be a few Barnes & Nobles, but you can get it at Barnes & Noble online as well as other online booksellers. We're coming out with an audio version this fall, so look for that. That's going to be going to be a fun project for folks to listen to the story. We're on Twitter, so you can find me there. LinkedIn, Jim Rooney at co-partner Rooney Consulting. Consulting is you can get the book at adifferentwaytowin.com. And then Rooney Consulting CCC, 3 C's at the end, is our website. So you can get a hold of me in all those places, and love the opportunity to speak to any organization that thinks would make sense. It's a real pleasure for me to sort of tell this story about my father and to see that what he did can be helpful to folks who are dealing with leadership issues, dealing with diversity issues, dealing with culture issues. I think that he did some things in my estimation that were pretty effective, and if I can be helpful in communicating those, I always enjoy getting to do that.
Continuing on a legacy, we will link to Jim Rooney's book, The Consulting Company, and Twitter in the transcript of this podcast too. So you'll be able just to connect with us directly over on workology.com. Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing more from you on leadership and diversity inclusion.
Jessica, it's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the time.
Conversations about leadership and culture are extremely important, and we need to be having more of them because those conversations really spark change. As HR leaders, we can support our company leaders with resources and training that can open up your D&I initiatives in a way that sets your company up for long-term success, while also setting an example of what doing the right thing looks like. Jim said during this interview, and I quote, "You arrive. You have to step into challenging situations." I love this approach and point of view. And I think this quote is something that we can all hold on to in our work and our life, especially what's going on right now. As HR leaders, we have arrived and we have had to step into challenging situations. Otherwise, your situation and the others in your circle of influence won't change. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, sponsored by Workology. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. My name's Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, you can visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.